I want to talk about our country's indebtedness. This is a message that I think is important to give. Most countries measure their indebtedness as a percentage of their gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product for all of you, I know y'all are economic development folks, so you understand that that is the gross output of a country. It's sort of like the revenues of a company, of your company. You might measure the amount of debt that you have compared to what your company revenues are. Well, that's the way you measure indebtedness as it relates to a country. And you can see today that the United States of America has 62% indebtedness in ratio to our gross domestic product. Now, this is the public debt that we as a country sell to other people. I think most of you know by now we have about $4.5 trillion that we've borrowed from ourselves that also has to be paid back. It's money that came out of the Social Security Trust. But this is the money that people have loaned to us. You may have bought Treasury bonds yourself, and therefore you've loaned money to the United States of America. On the path that we're on as a country, within the next 20 years, we're going to be at 146% of our gross domestic product. This little dot right here is something to basically put in relation to show where Greece was when it was bailed out by the European Union. It was at 120% of our GDP. I just came from Greece not long ago. I sat down with their finance minister, their prime minister, their central bankers, and I can assure you that our country is not Greece, okay? I mean, in Greece, almost to get anything done, you have to pay somebody. I mean, if you want a doctor's appointment, you got to find somebody to pay to set up the doctor's appointment. It's just the way their culture has evolved for generations. But the issue of the indebtedness is something that is an important correlation. And the fact is that Greece was at 120% of GDP when they had to be bailed out. We're moving quickly to 146. These numbers, or this slide shows you the amount of spending that takes place in our country, or has over the last 50 years. That's the red line. The blue line is the amount of revenues that our country has taken in over the last 50 years. And for those of you who talk to Zach and me and others constantly about bipartisanship, I do want to point out there's a little bit of hope, okay? Back here in the late 90s, this was a period when our revenues actually were above the amount of money we spent. We had a Democratic president, and we had a Republican Congress. The issues at that time weren't quite as serious as they are today as it relates to our spending problem, but the country worked together and solved that problem. Here's where we are today. We're at $1.47 trillion in gap this year. Now, you might imagine that we'd have a gap during a time when we have a recession, right? Because you have lower revenues and sometimes higher spending. Here's the problem that most thinking people in America, people like you, are concerned about, and that is that at this time, this gap never goes away. As a matter of fact, you look at it the year 2020, and the gap is still $1.25 trillion. So for people who are concerned about our future, our economic security like you, this is an issue. And I want you to, if you will, keep in your mind as we move through these slides this tremendous gap between the amount of money that's come into government and the amount of money that looks like that's going to be going out. By the way, these numbers are based on real budgets that exist today. This is not something that's made up by some partisan group. As a matter of fact, this is put together by the Congressional Budget Office. Just to put this in terms that all of you I know really can understand fully, in 2008, the average Tennessee household earned $43,000. Those are the most recent numbers, okay? Using Washington logic, and thankfully none of you do, you would spend, that would be like making $43,000 and spending $74,000 every single year. The point here is that for every dollar that we spend in Washington, and by the way, we're spending money on current needs, most of it is not investment, okay? We are borrowing 40 cents. And I think most Americans, I know Tennesseans across this state, understand that that cannot continue. Just to go back to how that's been breaking down, in 1970, 62% of the money we spent was called discretionary spending. In other words, Congress could decide where that money was going on an annual basis. 31% of it was on mandatory spending like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and 7% was on interest payments. Fast forward to today, look at this. 56% of the money that is spent in 2010 goes to mandatory spending, entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. 6% to interest payments, and only 38% to things like defense, highways, education, things that I think most of you would perceive to be very important. And this is something that I hope will shock most of you. And that is, by the year 2035, on the course that we are on as a country, mandatory spending will be 49%, and the reason it's smaller, it will have been crowded out by 25% of our money going to interest payments, $2.27 trillion, and only 26%, again, being used to do those things like defense, like highways, like education, like homeland security. Again, just to point out where we are, this year we spent $187 billion on interest, which greatly dwarfed Department of Transportation, $69 billion, Homeland Security, $49 billion, Education, $45 billion. Look, this is just in 2020. We're talking about a decade from now. These are not numbers that, can change easily. By the year 2020, we will be spending $916 billion a year on interest. And look how that dwarfs those things that many of you would consider to be very important. Transportation, 83, Homeland Security, 59, Education, $54 billion. Back in 1960, Americans loaned the American government money, right? I mean, our parents bought treasury bonds. They invested in America. Only 5% of the debt that we had at that time was held by foreign governments. Let's fast forward to today. This is something that I think also people are paying attention to. Today, 46% of the money that we borrow comes from foreign entities. Now, we're thrilled that Alstom is here today. We're thrilled that Volkswagen is here. We understand that this is an international, global economy, and we're playing a great role in that. But one of the things that I think concerns a lot of people is just the makeup of this indebtedness. Today, 10% of that indebtedness is owned by China. I read yesterday in the Wall Street Journal where they're cutting back a little bit of the amount of American debt they own. But let me just tell you a little story, and I'm not an alarmist, okay? But I used to talk to, many of y'all remember Hank Paulson, don't you, the Treasury Secretary under George Bush? I think most of you remember waking up on Monday mornings and reading what the Treasury Department had done that weekend, right? I remember walking into a Parliament building in Ukraine, and my cell phone rang, and it was Hank Paulson telling me that we had just done something very unusual with a company called AIG, okay? Well, I'm kind of a 7-day-a-week guy, and I think y'all know that by now, and Hank Paulson obviously during those days was a 7-day-a-week guy, and I used to talk to him all the time on the weekend. He would tell me that I'm concerned about China. I'm concerned about China, Bob. And then I think some of you have read his book where he talked about the fact that during the time of our financial crisis in this country, he got wind of a scheme that Russia was trying to get China to stop buying our securities, to stop buying our mortgage-backed securities and others, to put further distress on our country. Now again, I'm not an alarmist, but I do think as you borrow lots of money, it's important to understand the makeup of that, and it's important to understand what kind of position that puts you in. I want to go back to Greece and say that when Greece had its issues, and again, we're not Greece, it was the European Union community that basically sat down and told them what they were going to do to get their house in order to have that money loaned to them. There's plenty of blame to go around, okay? And I have found in Washington, as I certainly knew as a mayor, and as I certainly knew as the owner of a company, it's very hard to accomplish anything when you try to blame somebody, right? And I can assure you that both parties, both major parties in our country, have enabled us to get in the position we're in, okay? And we're not going to solve the problem we have as a country by trying to point fingers. How do we solve this problem? And what I'm trying to do with this meeting with you today and talking about this is to really change the debate, okay? Let's talk about something that maybe helps us solve the problem. Over the last 50 years, our federal government has spent about 20.3% of the GDP of our country. It's been that way on and off for 50 years. Our revenue has been about 18%. In other words, over time, over 50 years, we've spent about 2.3% more than we've taken in from the standpoint of the GDP. And there are economists, by the way, on both sides of the aisle that say you could do this ad infinitum, that as long as your economy is growing, you can continue to do this. Now let me say this, I don't like that personally. I'm not someone who is comfortable with this because you go through periods of time where growth doesn't take place. I'm far more comfortable making sure that we actually balance the budget. So it seems to me that what we need to do as a country is figure out what is that level of spending? What is it we should do to make sure to bring us together? Erskine Bowles was the chief of staff to Bill Clinton. He happens to be the co-chairman of something called the Deficit Reduction Commission that President Obama has put together. And Erskine Bowles, a Democrat, has said that he believes that the amount of spending in relation to our gross domestic product ought to be 21%. Our 50-year average is 20.3%. Bob Corker may be more comfortable at 18%, but my point is, somewhere between 18 and 21, there's a deal. And I just want to announce to the world, as one senator, I'm open to negotiation, okay? But the point is, we as a country need to change the debate. The debate right now is, should we extend certain tax cuts? Should we cut certain programs? That's the wrong debate to be having. The first debate we should have as a country is what percentage of our gross domestic product do we want the federal government to have? And until we decide what that is, I want you to focus your mind back on that slide where you see that red line running up. Until we do that, there is no way to close the gap, because you could chase that red line with tax policy until you're blue in the face and never get there. And I don't think that's what our country wants to do. This is the part I want to shock you. Most Americans think that our debt issue is academic. It's going to affect somebody else. Maybe it affects their neighbor. Maybe it affects somebody else down the road. This is something that I hope has a little bit of shock and awe, okay? Because the fact is that if you were going to try to close the gap between the amount of money that comes in and the amount of money that's spent over the next decade, and that's the kind of the length of time that most Americans can think, right? A decade, we can have a vision for a decade at the Chamber. That's kind of the way we can have a vision as a community for a decade. In order to close that gap, believe it or not, we would have to cut $6.7 trillion in spending to get back to Bob Corker's number, to get to Erskine Bowles' number. And I spent a lot of time talking with him on the phone a couple of weeks ago. Really smart guy. Ran for Senate as a Democrat in North Carolina. Good guy. To get to his number, you got to cut $3.4 trillion. To get to what's been our 50-year average, you've got to cut $4.5 trillion in a decade. But to get to my number, we would have to cut $670 billion a year over the next 10 years to get to a balanced budget. That is more money than we spend annually on Medicare. That is more money than we spend annually on defense with 2 wars. The thing we have to do is fundamentally change the way Washington does business. I know we have, again, people from both sides of the aisle and people who are so turned off by our country, they don't want to be a part of either side of the aisle. They're part of something else. I don't blame you. But the fact is, no matter where you come from, okay, I promise you, if you watched the way Washington handles your money, you would be embarrassed. I mean, it's discouraging. We have things like, let me just give you an example. We have this thing called PAYGO, okay? And so the creators of PAYGO, what they did in advance was say, okay, we're going to put in something called PAYGO, but all the things we want to spend money on, we're going to exclude in advance. And by the way, if we weren't creative enough on the front end, we've got this little thing we can do called emergency spending. And if you declare something an emergency, you can spend on it anyway. We've done $266 billion worth of that since February, unpaid for, okay? I mean, we've got to have a different construct in Washington. Here's what I'm advocating, okay? And we're drafting a bill. Matter of fact, we've drafted a bill. It's a 9-page bill, believe it or not. And I'm sure that it'll change over time. But the fact is, it's a construct that forces Washington, forces politicians, forces us to actually constrain and cap spending to a portion of the GDP. Let me tell you what's happening in Western democracies and what has happened in this country. The fact is, politicians in Western democracies around this world, but especially here, politicians like to be reelected. And in order to be reelected, what politicians do is they try to please their citizens. And for a long time, and I don't know what length of time that is, but it's in modern times, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, what politicians have been saying to you is that we can give you these things, but you don't really have to pay the price. We can borrow the money for it. And candidly, our citizenry have sort of known that in the back of their head. They've sort of known that that exists, but I don't want to be offensive. Our citizenry sort of been okay with that. I mean, you have this eerie feeling that this cannot continue, but we continue to allow it to take place, and we continue to elect people, candidly, who want to do these things for us. I have to tell you, I don't expect to pass a bill in January. Obviously, I'm not going to offer this until after we get through the silly season here, where nothing in Washington, hopefully, is going to take place until next year. Most of what's happening in Washington today, and I think y'all know that, is one side trying to gain advantage over the other until November. Nothing really serious is going to happen. And again, I don't expect to pass this bill in January, but what I hope I'll do, and I hope that what we've done today at lunch to some degree, is at least to get our citizens to focus on the most important issue first, and that is, hey, how much? What's the right number? Okay? How much should we really allow the federal government to have of our gross domestic product? And again, a very influential Democrat, okay, somebody that's leading the President's Debt Commission, and myself are very close already, okay? My sense is that that's something we as a country ought to have a real debate about, okay? And to me, it's something that can bring us together. And I want to tell you why in just one second. I doubt there's anybody in this room that runs their household in such a manner as to enjoy going out to restaurants at night and going on lavish vacations and putting that on credit and saying, you know, my kids will take care of this down the road. I don't think there's anybody in this room that would intentionally run their life that way. I just don't think so. And I really do think that the way that we've conducted ourselves up until right now has put all of us in a situation to be the first generation of American people, and this sounds like a cliche, but it's true, the first generation of American people to really leave the country worse off than they found it. Again, plenty of blame to go around, both sides of the aisle. I can't imagine that anybody in this room wants to do that. And again, I'm trying to change the debate. What I'm hoping that you will do, here's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to say, look, you know, we've been blessed here in Hamilton County and in this region. It's incredible what's happened as our elected officials have worked in the most unusual upbeat partnership that probably has happened in any community in the South, candidly. But the fact is that we know that this is something that we as a country have to deal with, and you politician running for federal office, we'd rather go ahead and tighten our belts. We'd rather make those tough decisions that we need to make. We'd rather be the generation of folks that has left our country in a better place. Now look, I know we're not going to cut, probably by the end of the debate, we're not going to cut $670 billion a year, okay? I know that's probably not going to happen. I realize that, you know, we're going to probably figure out a little bit different path. I hope we do. There's a lot of people in Washington, for what it's worth, that think we don't have the courage as a country to deal with this. And we won't deal with it until there's a crisis. And then when there's a crisis, there's going to be a lot of gnashing of teeth. That's what most people are betting on. They really are. And you look around this state and country today, just with the financial crisis we've had, and you look at what it's done to hurt people, especially, I might add, lower income and middle income folks. You think about this type of crisis where we hit the wall and all of a sudden people who've lent us money are helping us decide what we need to do as a country. I just don't believe that's the case. But let me give you the other side of this, which is now hopefully uplifting. I think we as a country can decide on the right number, and I'm going to do everything I can as one senator to move the debate to there. How much is the right number, okay? But think about it. For those people who actually want to make this as painless as possible, what that means is that then we're joined together as a country around a tax policy that does what? It's a tax policy that grows that gross domestic product, right? Because as that pie gets bigger, right, it's a whole lot easier to deal with these issues. So what I hope we'll do as a country, let's get together around that number and let's figure out a policy, a tax policy that generates economic growth, that causes this country to continue on the path that we've been on for the last 50 years to make us even stronger. I'll close with this. I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe this is the greatest country that ever has been. I think that it's an incredible place that we find ourselves. It only takes going to any other country in the world, any other country, and y'all have given me the privilege to meet with world leaders in their places around this world. You go to any of those places and spend 10 minutes, and I promise you, you know very quickly this is the greatest country in the world.